The gun was already on the table before anyone said a word. Weston Hale set it there himself, not as a threat, just as a fact. The way other men might set down car keys or a coffee cup, it was how he began every meeting that mattered. This one mattered. 14 men in that boardroom, 3 of them were guests, or that was the polite word for it. 2 had flown in from Zurich. 1 had come from somewhere that didn't appear on the itinerary his assistant had prepared. They spoke to each other in a language that wasn't English, and they did it constantly, in low tones, even when Weston's own translator was mid-sentence. Especially then. His translator's name was Bradford. Bradford had 3 degrees from Georgetown and a LinkedIn profile that listed 7 languages. Bradford had been sweating through his collar since the Zurich men walked through the door, and he hadn't stopped. Nobody noticed the woman mopping the hallway outside. Her name was June Patton, and she had been cleaning the 42nd floor of Hale Capital's headquarters for 11 months. She knew which partners left their lunch in the wrong trash cans. She knew which assistant cried in the bathroom on Thursday afternoons. She knew that the large corner office smelled like cedar and old ambition, and that the man who occupied it never looked at her when she came in to empty his wastebasket. Not once, not in 11 months. That was fine. She was used to it. June was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, soft in the middle, in a way that her mother called sturdy, and her ex-boyfriend had called something else. She wore her hair clipped back under a company-issued cap. Her cart had a squeaky left wheel that she'd reported twice and given up on. She moved through the 42nd floor the way weather moves through, present, functional, unremarkable. She had not planned to be in the supply closet at the end of the south corridor at 7:43 on a Wednesday night, but the floor buffer had jammed again, and the maintenance request would take 2 days, and June had learned a long time ago that if you wanted something done, you did it yourself. She was elbow-deep in the machine's underbelly when she heard the boardroom door open, the one with the faulty magnetic latch that never quite clicked shut. She heard everything. She didn't mean to. She tried not to. She focused on the buffer's belt mechanism and told herself it wasn't her business, but the voices carried the way voices do in empty corridors, and what the Zurich men were saying to each other, in German, fast and clipped and utterly certain they wouldn't be understood, made the back of June's neck go cold. They were going to sign nothing. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they'd never intended to. The entire meeting, the flight from Zurich, the hotel in Midtown, the handshakes and the mineral water, and the $400 steaks at dinner the night before. All of it was theater. A delay tactic. They were holding Weston Hale in this room while someone else moved on his Seattle assets. Someone who knew exactly where those assets were and exactly how unprotected they'd be if Weston was sitting in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of his own building thinking he was closing a deal. The younger Zurich man, the one with the silver watch, laughed softly and said, in German, that it would be over before Hale even poured the second round. June set down the buffer belt. She sat very still for a moment on the floor of the supply closet, with the squeaky cart and the smell of industrial cleaner and the hum of the building around her. Her hands were perfectly steady. She had always been good at that stillness. People mistook it for slowness sometimes. They always had. She thought about walking out the service exit, clocking out, going home to her apartment and her cat, and the German paperback she'd been reading for the past week, because she was between library holds. She thought about all of that, very clearly. Then she stood up, tucked them into her apron pocket, and walked to the boardroom door. The room went silent. The second, she pushed it open. 14 men looked at her. Bradford. The translator looked at her. Weston, the Zurich men, the older one with the grey suit and the younger one with the silver watch, looked at her with the particular blankness of people who have already dismissed what they're seeing before they've finished seeing it. "Excuse me," she said. "Mr. Hale, I need a moment." The silence stretched. Someone cleared a throat. She didn't know who. Weston Hale was not what she'd expected from 11 months of emptying his wastebasket. She'd expected smooth. She'd expected the kind of man who wore confidence the way other people wore clothes. And he was that, she could see it. But there was something else underneath it tonight. Something tight around his jaw. He'd known, on some level, that this meeting was slipping. He just didn't know why. He looked at her the way people look at something they can't immediately categorize. June Patton, in her grey uniform and her company cap, standing in the doorway of his $40 million boardroom with her hands folded in front of her. "This isn't a good time," he said, not unkindly, just factual. "I know," June said. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't important." The older Zurich man. His name was Reinhardt. She'd heard it through the door, said something to his colleague in German. It was not a compliment. The silver watch man smiled. June looked at them both. Then she looked at Weston Hale. "You should know," she said, in the same level voice she used for everything, "that your guests just confirmed they have no intention of signing. This meeting is a stall. Someone is moving on your Seattle portfolio right now, while you're in this room. They said it would be over before you poured the second round." The room didn't go silent. Exactly. It went still in a different way, the way air goes still before something breaks. Bradford said, "Now, wait a minute." "She's lying," Reinhardt said in English for the first time all evening. His accent was precise and cold. "She's a cleaning woman. She doesn't know what she's talking about." June turned to face him. She kept her voice very calm. "You said," and she repeated it back to him in German, word for word, exactly as he'd said it, "that it will be finished before Hale pours the second round. Your words. You were talking to Klaus." She nodded toward the silver watch man. "You've been discussing it since you sat down. I can go back further if you'd like." Reinhardt's face did something complicated. "She's bluffing," the silver watch man said, also in German. She picked up a phrase. "She doesn't speak it." June switched to the other man's dialect. Slightly different, southern, the way she'd learned it in her grandmother's kitchen, from her grandmother's old friends who'd immigrated decades ago, and said, precisely, that she had been listening for 20 minutes, that she understood every word, and that he might want to think carefully about his next sentence. The silver watch man stopped talking. Weston Hale was looking at her differently now. "Where are you from?" he asked. It was not the question she'd expected. "Cincinnati," she said. "My grandmother was from Munich. I picked up German early." She paused. "I also heard your interpreter miss 3 separate clauses in the last hour, the one about the secondary clause in the Zurich holding schedule. Bradford translated it as a standard delay. It wasn't. It was a forfeiture trigger." Bradford made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Weston Hale stood up from the table. "Get Mercer on the phone," he said, to no one in particular, or to everyone, it was hard to tell. The room snapped into motion. 2 of his men were already moving toward the door. One was on a phone. The Zurich men sat very still, and June noticed, absently, the way she noticed things, that the older one's hand had moved under the table. "Don't," Weston said without looking at him, just that one word. It landed like something heavy. Reinhardt's hand came back up. The next 40 minutes were not something June had planned for. She stood near the window. Someone had gestured her toward a chair, and she'd declined out of habit, and answered questions when she was asked them, and translated when she was needed, and tried not to think about whether she was going to have a job tomorrow. It turned out the Seattle situation was containable. Barely, but containable. Weston's man Mercer had picked up on an anomaly in the transfer timestamps and had already flagged it, which meant the window was closing on the other side's move. What the information from June gave them was the confirmation to act fast instead of hesitant. 32 minutes after she'd walked through the door, Weston Hale had protected $340 million worth of real estate assets. The Zurich men were escorted out without ceremony. The boardroom emptied slowly, the way rooms do when the emergency has passed and people are processing what just happened. June waited until most of them had gone because she wasn't sure what to do with herself, and standing near the window seemed as reasonable as anything else. Weston Hale stayed. His jacket was off. She didn't know when that had happened. He was standing at the end of the long table, looking at nothing in particular, the way people do when they're recalibrating. He turned and looked at her, like she was something that required his full attention. "How many?" he asked. She knew what he meant. 7, she said. Conversational in 5. Reading in 6. My German is the strongest. French is close. I have some Mandarin, but I wouldn't trust it in a business setting. How long have you been on this floor? 11 months. Something moved behind his eyes. I've never seen you. I know, she said. Not accusatory, just true. He was quiet for a moment. What's your name? June Patton. He repeated it once quietly, like he was filing it somewhere it wouldn't get lost. Then you should have been doing something else. Something. He stopped, recalibrated. You went to school for this? The languages? I went to school for linguistics, and then my mother got sick, and then the job market was what it was, and then I needed health insurance, and the cleaning service offered it on day 1. She shrugged one shoulder. That was 4 years ago. He looked at her for a long moment. The gun was still on the table. She'd noticed it when she walked in and hadn't thought about it since. Now it struck her as strange that she'd been in this room for 40 minutes with that on the table, and it had simply seemed like furniture. I almost lost everything tonight, he said. Yes, she agreed, because my translator missed a forfeiture trigger. 3 of them, technically, but the third one was the one that would have cost you. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the shape a smile would leave if it had just passed through. You're not what I expect, I know. I mean that as, I know how you mean it, June said. It's fine. He was quiet again. Then, I'd like to offer you a job. Something that uses the, he stopped himself. Something appropriate. June looked at him steadily. There was something she needed him to understand, and she decided she might as well say it while she had his full attention, because she suspected it would be harder to say once she was back to being the woman with the squeaky cart. I'd consider it, she said. But I want you to know something first. I've been on this floor for 11 months. I've heard every meeting you've had in that office, through the walls. I know your Q2 projections and your liability exposure and the name of the situation in Jakarta that you haven't told your board about yet. I know because no one thought to keep their voices down around me. She let that sit for a second. If you're offering me a job because you trust me, actually trust me, then yes. If you're offering it because you want to manage me, that's something else. The silence was different from the other silences. This one had weight. That's fair, Weston Hale said. I'm not finished, June said. The health insurance needs to match what I have now, and I'm not taking a job with a title that sounds like an afterthought. The not-quite smile came back this time. It made it all the way. What title did you have in mind? Director of Intelligence Operations, she said. Or something in that neighborhood. We can discuss it. Weston Hale looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough for June to wonder if she'd miscalculated, if she'd misread the room and the moment and the whole night. She had always been better at languages than people. Then he said, Can you start Monday? She could. She went back to the supply closet. First, finished fixing the buffer belt that no one else had gotten to. Clocked out at 9:17, same as always. On the elevator down, a security guard she'd never spoken to held the door for her and said, Rough night? She said, not really, and meant it. On the street outside, it was raining, the kind of rain that hadn't decided yet whether it was serious. June stood under the awning for a minute and thought about her mother, who had waited tables for 30 years and spoken 4 languages, and never once used them for anything beyond ordering coffee abroad. She thought about her grandmother, who had said, when June was 8 and going through a phase of being embarrassed about being different, the thing about knowing a language is that you become invisible to the people who speak it, and invisible people hear everything. June's grandmother had been a very smart woman. She pulled up her hood and walked to the subway. 3 weeks later, a reporter from the business section of a financial magazine called for comment on a story about a failed hostile move against Hale Capital's Pacific Northwest holdings. The piece mentioned a confidential tip that had reached Weston Hale's team at a critical moment. The reporter wanted to know the source. Weston's communications director said it was an internal security matter and offered no further comment. In her new office, which had a window and a proper door and no squeaky cart, June read the article on her lunch break. She had a cup of coffee from the machine down the hall, which was better than the one by the service entrance. Not dramatically better, but noticeably. Her assistant, a 24-year-old named Perry, who had been skeptical about everything for the first week and was now taking notes like his life she'd seen the piece. "I saw it," she said. "They don't mention you," he said. "No, she said. "Does that bother you?" June looked out her window for a moment. 42nd floor, same as before. The city was doing what cities do in the morning, moving fast, not looking up, not noticing most of what was right in front of it. "Not even a little," she said. Perry nodded, wrote something down, and left her to her coffee. An hour later, Weston Hale appeared in her doorway, not something she'd gotten used to yet, the way he moved through the building now, stopping at offices he hadn't previously visited, making himself visible in new ways. He'd been doing it since that night. She'd noticed. She noticed most things. "The Frankfurt situation," he said. "I need someone in the room Thursday." "I know," she said. "I already read the brief. You're going to want me to focus on the secondary party, the one your team has been calling the observer." "He's not an observer." Weston Hale leaned against doorframe and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the night in the boardroom, like he was still catching up. "How do you know?" "Because he hasn't said a word in any of the pre-calls," she said. "And the quiet ones are always the ones running the meeting." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You know, for 11 months, I walked right past you." "You did," June said. "I won't again." She looked up from the brief. "I know," she said. "That's why I took the job." He left her to her work, which was considerable, and which she was very good at, and which, for the first time in 4 years, used the parts of her that had always been there, waiting, in the woman that no one had thought to look at twice.